Hello and welcome to today's webinar featuring Maureen Durkin. I'm Claire Cameron, Engagement Editor at Spectrum, the home for autism research, news and analysis. We'll begin the presentation in a moment, but first, know that we'll be fielding questions at the end of today's presentation. But you can ask them at any point during the session. To ask a question, submit them via the chat window to the left of your screen. And as always, I'll note that if there are any members of the press tuning in, you can only report information presented during this webinar if that material has already been published elsewhere, or if you have first obtained express written permission from the presenter. Maureen Durkin joins us today from Madison, Wisconsin. Professor Durkin is an epidemiologist, professor of population health science and pediatrics, and Weizmann Center investigator at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She received her PhD in anthropology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and her Master of Public Health and Doctor of Public Health degrees in epidemiology from Columbia University. Durkin has conducted studies of the epidemiology of neurodevelopmental disabilities in the U.S. and internationally, and is currently Principal Investigator of the Wisconsin site for the Center for Disease Control and Prevention's Autism and Developmental Disabilities Monitoring Network and Case Control Study to explore early development in autism spectrum disorder. She is also a Fellow of the American College of Epidemiology. Durkin is also the principal investigator of a project to develop and evaluate models for providing integrated care for children and youth with autism. Welcome, Professor Durkin.
Thank you very much, Claire, for that introduction. I'd also like to thank Spectrum for hosting this webinar and for inviting me to speak on the epidemiology of autism and of intellectual disability. Here's an outline of what I would like to cover. First, I'll describe in a very brief and selective way some of the epidemiologic features of intellectual disability and autism, pointing out, on the one hand, some commonalities between the two conditions, and on the other hand, two important differences in the risk factors and in recent trends over time. I'll then review some of the evidence and some potential explanations for the different trends in intellectual disability, which seems to be falling over time, and autism, which is rising in prevalence. Finally, I would like to talk about the disability perspective, which has been adopted by researchers and advocates in intellectual disability. And I think autism researchers and advocates might have some lessons to learn from intellectual disability in this regard. As background and contextual information, for the trends that we're seeing recently in intellectual disability and autism, I want to just point out that over the past 100 years in the U.S. and globally, we've seen huge declines in both infant and child mortality. These are data for the U.S. from 1915, when some 10% of babies born in this country died during infancy and another 2% during childhood. And these rates have dramatically fallen. These are the numbers for child mortality. And these declines are due to advances in medicine and in public health. The reason that those declines in mortality are relevant to our discussion today is that it's in the wake of those declines that we've seen rises in the prevalence of disabilities and activity limitations in children over time. And what this slide shows is from 1960 through 2011 in the U.S., based on National Health Interview Survey data. We've seen a steady increase over time in the proportion of children who have chronic disabilities. And Amy Tautro and others who have analyzed these data point out that not only is the overall prevalence increasing over time, but the proportion of disabilities in children that are characterized as behavioral or mental has increased over time as well, whereas the proportion due to physical disabilities has declined. And more recent data, this is just another snapshot from National Health Interview Survey and from the National Survey of Children with Special Health Care Needs in the United States, has shown even continuing in this most recent era of rising prevalence of these conditions. Dr. Hautro and others have also pointed out that over time the rise seems to be steeper in more affluent families. So the rise in prevalence of chronic disabilities in children seems to be increasing more in affluent families than in very poor families in the United States. But the trend is also present among children living in poverty. And what's shown in this slide are the recent rise in child disability since the early 90s in children who receive Social Security income for disability. And those numbers are increasing over time as well. And then similarly, among children living below the federal poverty level, the proportion that are receiving supplementary income for disability has also been increasing over this time period. And then when we look at special education data, overall for all forms of special education needs, those numbers have also climbed over the decades, although recently they seem to be leveling off in the United States. So with this backdrop of rising prevalence of disability overall among children in the United States, let's look more closely at two of the types of disability that contribute to these trends. One is intellectual disability and the other autism. And in this slide I've shows that the terminology for intellectual disability has changed over time. And in 2010, the U.S. Congress passed Rosa's Law, which is a federal law that mandates that all references in federal statutes and publications to mental retardation will be changed to intellectual disability. This change in the terminology was prompted by advocacy for a disability perspective, which we'll discuss later in this webinar. And a crucial difference can be seen here in the difference between a more disorder and disability perspective. Under DSM-4, we saw that let's see, I'm trying to get the pointer to work here, that the definition of mental retardation, as it was called then, was based purely on IQ, or intellectual quotient. Whereas over time, as the adoption of a disability perspective and the change in the terminology, the characterization of disability is based, instead of on impairment or a deficit in intelligence, it's based on the level of support needed. And so that's just some indication of the change in perspective from disorder to disability. And no matter what terminology is used, the fundamental feature in intellectual disability is measured in terms of IQ, and the definition is typically with an IQ score below 70, individuals will meet criteria for an intellectual disability. Historically, that left tail of the IQ distribution has been longer than we'd expect based just on normal distribution in the population. And the thinking here is that there's a separate population of individuals with brain disorders or brain damages, which is associated with low intelligence. And so there's almost a separate distribution of individuals with intellectual disability with a spread of IQ scores in their own. Now, autism, as we most on this call might be familiar with the DSM-5 classification of autism. And in contrast to intellectual disability, autism diagnosis is based more on categorical concepts of and counting the number of and types of behavioral impairments in order to meet criteria for an autism diagnosis. So just in terms of the two disorders, there are a number of similarities and differences. And in this slide, I've summarized major similarities, and this stems from the fact that they are both neurodevelopmental disabilities with onset early in life and often lifelong consequences. And in yellow and bold on this slide are where they're different. All the other ways they're very similar in the way that they are identified and their implications. For both, whereas in intellectual disability, the core feature is low intelligence. In autism, it's these impairments in social communication, reciprocity, and repetitive behaviors and restricted interests. So otherwise, they're quite similar. And for both intellectual disability and autism, early intervention is considered essential to enhancing developmental outcomes. Another similarity between intellectual disability and autism is that neither is a single condition. They're both made up of multiple different causes, and in the case of both conditions, most cases that occur in the population are due to unknown causes. What this slide shows in the left column are the major categories of causes of intellectual disability: genetic, nutritional, infectious, toxic exposures, trauma, perinatal factors, psychosocial deprivation, and risk, in terms of risk factors, things like the sex ratio and family history. And then in this, in the right column, I've listed some specific examples of causes of intellectual disability, and in bold are the ones that are common to autism and intellectual disability. So many of the specific causes of intellectual disability are also could be seen as causes of autism, or many of the individuals exposed to these have both conditions, and those are listed on this slide. Another similarity in the epidemiology of the two conditions, intellectual disability and autism, is that there's a very large overlap. What's shown in this slide are recent data from the CDC's MADSPA project for surveillance program for 2010. And what these data show is that overall, when you combine autism and intellectual disability among 8-year-old children in the population, the prevalence is about 22 per 1,000 children, or about 2.2% overall. And then about a quarter of those children with one condition or the other have both. So then within each condition, within autism, about a third of the cases also have intellectual disability. And similarly, among children with intellectual disability, approximately a third also have autism. Now that's as far as the similarities go. I'm now going to focus on two critical differences in the epidemiology of autism and intellectual disability. And one is with the relationship with socioeconomic status. And this is especially in the United States, where there seems to be a difference between the two disorders. But on the left, what's shown is data from recent study on the prevalence of intellectual disability in the United States, showing what is a very typical socioeconomic gradient for intellectual disability, with the prevalence being highest in the lowest socioeconomic group, in this case children with mothers without a high school education, and then the prevalence declining with increasing maternal education. This pattern for intellectual disability has been shown all over the world, in any country where it's been studied, pretty much. And it really doesn't vary at all. Whereas with autism, we see kind of the opposite pattern here, at least in the United States, where we see with increasing socioeconomic status, we see a rising prevalence of autism spectrum disorder. Now, in contrast, this is unusual among developmental disabilities to see a pattern like this, and it's also not entirely consistent around the world. In Scandinavian countries and in a recent study from France, they didn't find this association. And in some countries, it's a slightly opposite gradient with a higher prevalence in the lowest social class. But in studies from England and Australia, as well as the United States, we see this type of SES gradient of increasing prevalence with increasing social class. Now, in terms of the trends in the two different conditions, there's also a major difference. What's shown in this slide is sort of a review of the world's literature on the prevalence of intellectual disability over time. And In red are countries, low and middle income countries, and the blue bars are for high income countries. And what we see is certainly no evidence of an increase generally in the world over time in the prevalence of intellectual disability. And what we do see is this socioeconomic difference where the prevalence tends to be much higher in low and middle income countries, but no evidence of increase over time. These are the data for autism, beginning with the first epidemiologic study ever conducted in England in the 1960s. And then over time, you can see that it was in the 1990s that we started to see this dramatic rise in prevalence over time. So that's another way that the two conditions differ. Intellectual disability, no evidence of rise, as we'll discuss, possibly some evidence of decline, whereas in autism we see an evidence of increase. These are data going more to a local level. These are data from Wisconsin's special education system showing that since 1992 up to 2008, dramatic increase in the number of children served under the autism special education category. And then globally, the World Health Organization and the University of Washington, analyzing the global burden of disease data from around the world, they also show these opposite patterns for autism and intellectual disability. If you go into their query system and put autism, this is the trend line you see over time with a dramatic increase globally in the disability-adjusted life years associated with autism. If you put intellectual disability in, you get the absolute opposite pattern with a decline in frequency over time globally. Now, these are data from the Metropolitan Atlanta Surveillance System, again from the CDC, showing a similar kind of thing. What we see in the blue line is the prevalence of intellectual disability among children in Atlanta between 1996 and 2010. And this is intellectual disability without autism. The red line is autism without intellectual disability, and then the purple is children who have both intellectual disability and autism. And you can see that for autism, it's increasing over this time period, especially among those without intellectual disability declining. These are some of the only data we really have from the United States where we can look specifically at trends in intellectual disability over time. Now, there's many, just as many people with autism seeing these trends have raised the question, well, is this a real increase? Is autism really increasing over time? Or is this just improvements in detection and awareness and recognition? And you could ask the same question about the decline, the apparent decline in the frequency of intellectual disability over time. And it has been, Jeffrey Brosco and others have written about the possibility that intellectual disability could actually be declining in recent decades. And this is especially following what are referred to as the JFK era initiatives. This was during the Kennedy administration in the 1960s. And in fact, that is when the National Institute for Child Health and Human Development was established during this time, the early 1960s. And the major focus at that time was of war against mental retardation and discovering the preventable causes and then implementing interventions to reduce the prevalence of intellectual disability. And on this slide, I've listed some of these major initiatives that have actually potentially caused actual declines in the prevalence of intellectual disabilities in the population. So in addition to those actual interventions that prevent the causes of intellectual disability, there's another explanation out there for why we might be seeing a reduction over time in intellectual disability. And this is referred to as the Flynn effect, which is the fact that phenomenon that over the decades we're seeing increases in the intelligence of populations, and this has been seen all over the world. I think it's something like 2 IQ points per decade over the decades. Now, IQ tests are renormed every so often to take account of this, but they're not done every year, and it's possible that what we could be seeing is that as the average intelligence of the population improves over time, the proportion of individuals below that cutoff for intellectual disability could be declining. And then I just do want to point out, though, that not all causes of intellectual disability are showing evidence of decline over time. The number of specific causes that do not seem to have, we don't have any interventions, or for whatever reason they're not declining over time. One example is Down syndrome. This is a major leading cause of intellectual disability that's due to a genetic cause. Among the genetic causes, it's the leading one. And this, we do know how to prevent Down syndrome now. We have the technology to do that with early detection prenatally and then therapeutic abortion. And that technology has been available for some time. But a recent study by Lone and colleagues showed that even despite the technology to prevent Down syndrome, at least among live births, over time since early 90s here, we've seen and the blue line shows no change at all in the prevalence of Down syndrome among live births. These data are from Europe. And they attribute this flatness there to the fact that the births among women over 35 years has increased during this time. So that counters any other interventions that are in place to reduce the frequency in the population, and so the net effect is no change. Now, among children and adults with Down syndrome, we're actually seeing a prevalence increase over time, and that's because improvements in survival and longevity. So it's just an example of one disorder where we're not seeing a decline in prevalence over time. Now, another way to see in the data this evidence of decline in intellectual disability during the rise in autism is among children or individuals with autism. We can separate out those with intellectual disability and those without. And this is a summary of data from a recent review of the global literature on autism prevalence. And the green bars are the prevalence over time with autism and intellectual disability. The red bars are just autism alone with no intellectual disability. And you can see that much of the increase recently has been among the group without intellectual disabilities. A similar pattern can be seen in data from the ATOM network from the U.S., which has been monitoring the frequency of autism in the population since 2000. And these show from the years 2000 to 2012, what's shown in these bars is the proportion of children with autism who also have intellectual disability. And you can see that has declined from, it was more than 40% in 2000, and it's just been declining over time to now less than 30% of children with autism also have intellectual disability. Now, there's different theories about the association between autism and intellectual disability, and thinking about these might give some clues to what's going on in the reduction over time in the proportion of children with autism that also have intellectual disability. So one theory is that both conditions are due to a common underlying brain pathology that increases the risk of both autism and intellectual disability. And in children that do have both autism and intellectual disability, we also see more epilepsy and more cerebral palsy and other neurodevelopmental disorders. So the idea there is that it's a common pathology that results in both conditions. Another explanation is that it's the underlying intellectual disability leads to impairments in social interaction, repetitive behaviors, and so on that then qualify the child for getting a diagnosis of autism. Although, as we know under DSM-5, if the impairments in social interaction are due to underlying intellectual disability, I think they're not supposed to, that won't meet criteria for autism. But it's very difficult to know really which was the source of those impairments in social interaction. And then the third kind of explanation is that it's the underlying autism that results in lower IQ and causes some children with autism to have intellectual disability. And that could work in a couple of ways. For one is that it could be that the IQ is suppressed in some children with autism due to lack of cognitive stimulation, and it could be secondary to their autism impairments in social interaction and communication. Another thought is that the IQ, the intelligence, not really low in children with autism. In some children with autism, it's just that our ability to get an accurate measure of IQ is limited in some children, so it's really due to measurement error. And it's interesting that many of the most successful interventions for autism, early behavioral interventions, the biggest effect sizes are seen in IQ. And so that would support the idea that if you address those underlying behavioral impairments, you might see improvements in IQ. But what we see when we look at the epidemiology, both in the ADAM network data from the U.S. from 2000 to 2012, and in the MADSPA data just from Metropolitan Atlanta, we see over time there's not a decline in the prevalence of autism with intellectual disability. That's in blue. Those rates are rising, but they're just not rising as steeply as the autism without intellectual disability. So I want to consider some of the possible explanations for the increase in autism. We talked about possible reasons why intellectual disability might be declining, but one that's been raised many times is the expansion of diagnostic criteria for autism that has occurred over the decades. And this slide is from Kathy Rice, who's now at Emory, but she prepared this some time ago, showing basically how the estimates of the prevalence of autism over the years has been impacted by changes in the diagnostic criteria from Kanner's period up through DSM-4. In general, this shows pretty compellingly that much of the rise corresponded with adoption of DSM-3 and DSM-4 criteria for autism. So I don't think there's any question that some of the rise in prevalence we're seeing is related to the expansion of the concept of autism as a spectrum and the changes in the diagnostic criteria. And it was with these dramatic changes that the CDC in 2000, and part of the Children's Health Act of 2000, called upon CDC in the U.S. to begin to do surveillance of autism in the population using common methodology and criteria in different parts of the country, and really try to get a better handle on whether the rates are actually increasing or not. And every 2 years, we publish the results of these surveillance efforts in the MMWR, the monthly mortality weekly report from the U.S. And this slide just summarizes the data from 2002 to 2010, showing the prevalence, how that's changed over time in the ADAM data, stratified by race and ethnicity. And the second line from the top, that's sort of the overall prevalence over time has increased to the point where it was about 1 in 150 in 2002, and now it's 1 in 68, or basically about 1.5% of children meeting criteria. And I point this out because this is during a period where there was absolutely no change in the diagnostic criteria. For all of these surveillance years, DSM-4 TR criteria were used. And we saw the rise in all of the different racial and ethnic groups examined. Also during this period, we saw some increase in the sex ratio. So there's always been a very large excess male prevalence of autism. Every study everywhere finds it. But just in this ADAM network, we've seen, it seems that the rise in autism is going a little more steep for boys than girls over this period. So I think, just in summary, we can't necessarily attribute all of the rise to the expansion of diagnostic criteria, at least based on the ADAM data, because even after the criteria stayed the same, we've continued to see a rise over time. The other explanations for this rise include, especially based on the school data, it was really the adoption of autism as a category for receiving special ed that didn't begin in the U.S. until 1991, 92. And ever since then, we've seen a gradual adoption of that category, and that could account for that increase. And really, during the same period, we've had increased awareness of autism in the community. In the earlier days, most children with autism were in institutional care, and now that's no longer true. So many different things could be contributing to improvements in awareness and visibility of autism. These are the school data for the U.S. as a whole, showing a huge rise, and it's likely that the low numbers here are due to that it was a brand new category for receiving special education. Okay, another set of possible explanations for the rise in autism has been referred to as, well, we could call changes in diagnostic practices, so not criteria, but the practices. And many have written about the concept of diagnostic substitution, especially Paul Shattuck in his work, analysis of special education data. But there's also this idea of diagnostic accretion, which Peter Bierman and his colleagues have written about, which is that in the past, children with intellectual disability, for example, of a known cause, might not even be evaluated for autism because they had intellectual disability. But more and more, we're diagnosing autism in children with multiple different kinds of conditions. And so the number of diagnoses a child could have has been increasing. And then we've also seen an expansion of developmental screening, and specifically for autism, recommended by the American Academy of Pediatrics since 2006. So all of these changes could also be increasing the number of children recognized as having autism. In terms of the diagnostic substitution idea, these are data from the U.S. for children 6 to 17 years old with autism in yellow and intellectual disability in red. And you can see that as autism has risen, intellectual disability has declined. It's hard to look at these graphs like this without thinking that it could be that the diagnostic substitution could be an explanation that we used to call it intellectual disability, now we're calling it autism. But I think that it isn't, sometimes that term diagnostic substitution implies, oh, they just called it something else for convenience or to get services or something like that. But I think that we have to consider the fact that there's also been improvements in our diagnostic tools and screening so that our ability to diagnose autism has improved over time. And so it's not just simply substitution. And also, if we think about the possibility that the intellectual disability is declining, that could also be contributing to the decline there. These are data from children receiving SSI, or Social Security insurance. In other words, children living in poverty and also having disabilities. And it just shows the different categories, but I want to just point out that the red line here is autism, and the green line is intellectual disability. So we're seeing the same trend in these data as well, that this has nothing to do with special education. So it isn't just in special ed that we're seeing this evidence of the lines crossing with the two disorders. All right, so I've talked about a number of reasons why we might explain the rise in autism prevalence over the years, and it leaves one more category of explanations, and that could be changes in the actual risk factors for the disease. And what these risk factors can fall into many of the categories, all the categories we discussed earlier for intellectual disability, for example, genetic, environmental, and perinatal. And some people say that, well, with genetic changes in genetic factors couldn't cause such a rise in prevalence in such a short time period. But I don't know if that's entirely true, because we could think about things like assortative mating, or that could be affected by changes in technology, could happen over a fairly short period of time. Or also changes that might affect the rate of copy number mutations, things like that. So it's not entirely true that genetic factors couldn't contribute to changes in a relatively short time. And then there's a lot of research into possible environmental exposures that could be contributing to the increase in autism. Nothing so far is like lead poisoning or anything like that is ubiquitous and that is unequivocally associated, but there's a lot of research and interest in that area. We've also looked at a number of perinatal risk factors and gauged how much they could be contributing to the rise in autism prevalence over time. And I'll mention just a few of these. One is the relationship between the age of parenting and the risk of autism. And now there's been research done in a number of countries, and it's very consistent finding. It seems to be that with studies that are large enough to be able to study both the effects of mother's age and the father's age, find that both parents' age has an independent effect on the risk of autism. What's shown in this slide is the reference group is here. These are offspring of children with where both parents are relatively young. In this case, younger than 35 at the time of birth for the mother and younger than 40 for the father is the reference group. And then what's shown is the odds ratios with, going this way, if they have one parent with autism, it increases somewhat, with an older age parent. If both parents are older, the increase is higher. And then it's on this axis is birth order. So what we find is that the firstborn, in general, have a higher risk of autism than later born children, and a number of possible explanations for that. But and then also the having one or two parents, the number of parents that are older increases the risk of autism. So that a child who has two older parents and is a firstborn is more than 3 times as likely to have autism as the child with younger parents and later born. And it turns out that because of the changes in parenting, there's more and more children are offspring of older parents, and to some extent this could be contributing in a small way to the rise in prevalence over time. We've also looked at perinatal factors like interpregnancy interval, and this is also becoming increasingly consistent. A number of studies now showing that short pregnancy interval is associated with an increased risk of autism. If you think about it, women who delay pregnancy until their 30s, late 30s, say, or 40s, they then have more pressure to have a short interval because they don't have, this is all among second-born children. If they're going to have more children, they might not have much time, so there's a pressure over time to shorten that interval. And we haven't seen, even though it's a public health goal to lengthen the interpregnancy intervals, we haven't seen much evidence over time on that one. So regardless of the reasons for the rise in autism and the apparent decline in intellectual disability, one of the other things we're seeing is a real change in the scientific focus on these two conditions. So these are data from PubMed, just a number of publications. In the 1990s, there were many more publications related to intellectual disability than autism. Huge difference here. And over time, this line has crossed as well. We've seen some increase in intellectual disability, just as scientific output overall has increased, but the rise in intellectual interest in autism has really dwarfed intellectual disability at this point in time. Now I want to just in the final comments turn to this distinction between disorder and disability. Whereas the field of intellectual disability has adopted this the perspective of disability rather than seeing it as a disorder. And the question is whether the autism research and advocacy community could learn something from this. If we compare the two different perspectives, basically disorder perspective on the neurodevelopmental disability versus a disability perspective. And in a disorder perspective in general, the focus is on the incapacity or the lack or the impairment or deficit that resides in the individual. Whereas in a disability perspective, the focus is instead on seeing disability as a result of the interaction between the impairment in an individual or the lack and the functional limitations and also the environmental constraints that affect the functioning of the individual with impairment. And so the real important difference here is, I think, when you adopt a disability perspective, you realize that it's that the limitations experienced by the individual are as much a result of the society either not being as inclusive or putting up barriers to participation. And so that we can improve outcomes for people with disabilities by focusing on the overall environmental environment in addition to just the individual's impairments or problems. In a disorder perspective, we tend to think of the disorders as rare and the exception, whereas when you adopt a disability perspective, it's seen as something that's much more common and that actually affects most of us in our lifetimes. If we're fortunate to live long enough, we will experience disability. And then in general, the focus in the disorder perspective is on the impairment, as I mentioned, less so on functioning. Whereas in disability, there is a little recognition of the impairment and the functioning, but the bigger focus is on participation and what society can do to improve the participation of the individual affected. And this perspective on disability has been codified and promoted by the World Health Organization in its international classification of functioning, which is a complementary system to the ICD, or something like the DSM. Now, I just want to, with this focus on participation, and I want to just point out another difference between the two disorders, autism and intellectual disabilities. It came out in a recent study by Osmond and Paul Shattuck and his group, which studied young adults with autism and intellectual disability. And they found that, for the most part, young adults with autism were much more socially isolated in multiple domains than those with intellectual disability. And we don't know to what extent this is because the fundamental impairment in individuals with autism is in their social interaction, and that could be contributing to this. But it could also be that the focus in interventions and research related to the two disorders is different. And with intellectual disability, there's much longer history of focusing on employment and participation in society and things like that. And so, fortunately, within autism now, too, there is much more of a focus than there had been in the past on participation in society and seeing autism as just part of the variation in society. So the whole neurotypical movement and things like that is very consistent with this approach as well. So just in conclusion, what we've discussed is that the recent rises in the prevalence of autism have corresponded with declines in intellectual disability and in the percentage of children that have both autism. Among children with autism, the percentage that also have intellectual disability. We talked about a number of possible explanations of these trends, and they include changes in diagnostic practices, actual prevention of intellectual disability, improved awareness, and possible changes in survival and the impact of changes in risk factors. We also talked briefly about the socioeconomic disparity in autism prevalence in the United States. And this disparity really raises the question of whether the services and supports that are being dedicated to autism are reaching those in the greatest need. And from this socioeconomic disparity, we might think not. And work needs to be done in that area. And finally, we talked about how autism research could benefit by shifting to a more of a disability perspective and focusing not only on impairments, but also on levels of functioning and having better measures of this and measures of participation, the transitions over the life course, equitable access to services, and employment, quality of life, these kinds of things that really come into focus once you shift to a disability perspective. So thank you very much, and here's some of the references that might not have been included in other slides, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Maureen. We do have some questions on today's presentation. The first one that we are going to field, and we'll try to get through them all, but there have been quite a few, so if your question isn't asked during this time, we will try to get them answered for you after the presentation. This question comes from Penny Robinson, who asks, would the cost of medical appointments associated with getting a diagnosis be a confounder for the relationship between autism and socioeconomic status? For instance,
I'm sorry. Could you repeat that? I couldn't hear you very well.
Sure.
You faded out in the middle.
Sure. Would the cost of medical appointments associated with getting a diagnosis be a confounder for the relationship between autism and socioeconomic status? For example, some parents of low socioeconomic status might be unable to afford the testing to result in the diagnosis.
Yes, I think that's another way of putting it. Thinking of it as a confounder is another way of putting it. I do think all indications are it is a disparity, and that would mean that it's sort of an injustice. When we talk about differences in prevalence, there could be differences that are different. For example, the male excess, we don't know if that's really a disparity. It could be that boys are just at higher risk for autism. But when we see the social class difference like this, it raises a question of whether there's an economic barrier that is preventing some from getting the diagnosis of autism. And I agree with the question around that. We don't know for sure, but the autism is the most costly of the developmental disabilities. It's one of the most expensive to diagnose, and the interventions for it are more than $50,000 a year. And it appears that those aren't necessarily reaching the children, low-income children at this point.
Okay, another question comes from Susan Spracher, who asks, what are the ways, for example, statistically, that we can distinguish between a true rise in the prevalence of autism in affluent families versus a rise in prevalence in affluent families due to better access to care, enabling them to receive the autism diagnosis earlier?
I think that the statistical analyses can only do so much. We can describe the difference, and really to be able to tease out whether it's due to economic resources and access to care or something else would require studies which we don't really have. But one would be like a nationally representative longitudinal study that could look at the factors associated with autism and distinguish them from access to services. So if we had routine screening, even the screening now is not available to everybody. It's not really universal yet. So I don't think we'd have a statistical means of doing it without the actual data to begin with. And that might require a nationally representative longitudinal study.
Okay. Susan Santangelo asks, regarding the increase in the sex ratio Isn't it true that it varies by IQ level and that the sex ratio is less when both sexes have intellectual disabilities?
Yes, I think that's something, it's a good point. We have noticed in the ADAM data that that girls with autism are more likely to have intellectual disability than boys. And we don't know why this is. Whether it's also just a detection thing, whether some have suggested that in order to get the diagnosis of autism, girls have to be more impaired, and that being more impaired is often associated with intellectual disability. That's a good question, and I think there just needs to be more research on this. We don't really understand it.
Further, just to check about Susan Tangella asked, and this might be useful for other participants, just what the definition of older parent for the data that's presented in the parental age and birth order slide?
Yes, in that paper, the definition for older parent was 35 or older for women and 40 or older for men, for the father. Different studies use different cutoffs, but either way, it's pretty consistent finding around from the larger studies that you see an association with both fathers and mothers' age after these cutoffs.
Another question comes from Robert Gauthier, who asks, when reviewing prevalence data of autism versus intellectual disability, do the data reflect the primary diagnosis? That is, does it reflect those who have both diagnoses?
Well, they do. I mean, in the sense that, here's where the epidemiologic data are somewhat crude. We don't know. They do reflect both diagnoses. We don't necessarily know which one came first or what the underlying cause was. But these are children who meet criteria for both conditions.
Okay. Another question comes from Martha Moyer, who asks whether or not there has been research on non-verbal learning disability prevalence in relationship to autism.
Not that I am aware of, but there too, I think that's another, at least not epidemiologically. I am not aware of it. But that's learning disabilities, another disorder that has been changing over time in the population, and I think most recently showing declines. But it's how often the nonverbal learning disabilities co-occurs with autism and the diagnostic implications of all that. We don't really have epidemiologic data that I know of.
Okay. Another question comes from Alexia Rakasi, who asks, do you think that autism epidemiological studies in Latin American countries are important, and do you have any advice from your own work internationally on how to best conduct epidemiological studies in low-resource settings?
I think epidemiologic studies of autism in Latin America are hugely important. There seems to be a dearth of studies from Latin America, and I don't know how much this is related to the language barriers for English speakers, because it may be that it's hard to search the Spanish literature, the Portuguese literature on this, but there does seem to be a real shortage of studies from Latin America. And I think one of the barriers, and this is something we've written about, is that the cost of doing autism studies is really high because of the cost of using the instruments for diagnoses. And autism is one of the rare disorders where you have to pay per use for the use of these instruments, which in low and middle income countries is really prohibitive. The cost of getting a diagnosis in the United States is thousands of dollars, and it's a barrier, and that could be what's contributing to the low rates of autism in the poorer children in the country. But when you try to go internationally, it's even a bigger barrier. And part of the problem, in addition to the cost, it's important to be able to adapt the instruments as needed, and not only the translation and back translations, but sometimes adapting them for local contextual and cultural contexts. And you're not allowed to do this for copyrighted instruments without paying. Some you can't do it at all, others you have to pay a lot. So there's a movement out now to develop low-cost, open access, open source tools to be able to allow autism diagnoses in low and middle income countries. So I think I will also just add with the things like the Zika epidemic in Latin America, there is some concern that microcephaly could just be the tip of the iceberg, so to speak, and there might be a range of neurodevelopmental disabilities associated with these infections. And so I think it's critical to be able to begin monitoring that as soon as possible.
Okay, we have another question from Diane Kennedy, who asks, are there any studies comparing diagnostic substitution from ADHD to autism, specifically the rates of autism with a prior diagnosis of ADHD?
Not that I know of, but it seems to me that while ADHD, while autism has been rising, ADHD has been rising too in these data to a large extent. So it isn't quite like the intellectual disability where we've seen at least over the decades, an apparent decline. With the data I've seen for ADHD seems to show a continued rise. But I do agree that the distinctions between these disorders and what actually gets diagnosed in the community and in the administrative, reflected in the administrative record makes it very difficult to tell actually what's going on.
Okay. We have another question from Elizabeth Knapp, who asked whether or not being an older father in comparison to being an older mother comes into play in the change in prevalence.
Right. I tell you that my reading on the literature, there have been some studies that show it's the mother's age, others that it's the father's. But the bigger studies that have enough data on both parents' age seem to show that it's associated with both. There was one study that suggested that if there's a discrepancy between the parents' age, large one, that could be associated. But I think that it's important to note with this parental age association that it's actually a fairly small association. It's consistent and it's statistically significant, but the fact is if having older parents doubles your risk or even triples your risk of autism, it might increase it from 1% to 3%, but it's not. 97% of those babies still don't have autism, and so I don't think it has public health implications that some things might have, that we might say that we should avoid it, therefore, because the research really hasn't been done to show that the different costs and benefits of older parenting, and it's quite likely that the benefits outweigh the costs and the risks in this regard. It's of interest for giving a clue to what some of the causes of autism might be. For example, the father's age has pointed to the potential for copy number mutations and things that increase as men age in the germline. And then for mother's age, it raises the questions of a whole bunch of other different things related to pregnancy complications and things like that. So the potential interventions and the etiologic explanations, it points to different ones, and I think it's more useful for that than for making recommendations at this point about older parenting.
Just quickly, and this will be our last question to follow up from that, is short interpregnancy intervals confounded by higher maternal age?
Well, yeah, but those studies typically will control for the parent's age and still find and in fact, yes. So it could be confounded, but even after controlling for parents' age, there seems to be this effect of short interval. And that points to a number of other hypotheses about etiology as well.
Okay, great.
Okay.
That's all that we have time for, unfortunately. Just so that everyone knows, a complete replay of the presentation will be available on the Spectrum news site in a couple of days. We'll be putting it on social media, so if you follow us on Twitter or Facebook, you'll be able to see the presentation there. The webinar is part of an ongoing series, so please check our site for upcoming talks to be announced soon and video archives of previous webinars. Thanks again, Professor Durkin, and thank you all for tuning in.